Welcome to the next installment of the Knox Trail story. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here. We have a great audience here in the Knox Trail room, the Knox Gallery, probably 30 or so people here. And we have another 5 or 10 who are watching us on Zoom. So thanks very much. I'm Rob Hoogs, president of the Historical Society. And it's my honor to introduce Bernie Drew, our speaker tonight. I think most of you know, but it's worth repeating, Bernie is an esteemed author, and I would really consider him, in a sense, my mentor as an historian. He produced this book, the Bible, if you will, about Knox Trail. It was published in 2012. I'm sure you spent quite a few years before that working on it, researching it. And it is just full of fascinating stories about the Knox Trail, the great war road, the road that existed that was used by so many people, including General Knox, Colonel Knox, Henry Knox at the time, was used by Jeffrey Amherst before him, and by Burgoyne's army coming through here after the Battle of Saratoga, and many, many others that Bernie will tell you the stories about. Bernie is also one of the co-authors of the upcoming book about the Knox Trail, which Ron Bernard is holding up here in the audience. You can't see it on Zoom. Soon to be published, and we will be having a program hopefully in about a month when the book has been printed. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out. So without further ado, here is Bernie Drew. Yay.
Hello. Hello. How am I doing? Talk into the microphone. If I do that, I can't see my papers. Rob has mapped out a series of programs, each on a different aspect of the Knox Trail. I'm more or less going to concentrate on the before and the after. And I'll start with read something from the Springfield Republican from 1928. Monterey, trail tablet dedicated. Knox marker exercises conducted by Village League. The stone tablet erected in Monterey to mark the Knox Trail was dedicated this afternoon with appropriate exercises. A large number of townspeople and summer guests were present. The marker is located in the center of the village, and the exercises were in charge of the Monterey Cooperative League. O.C. Bidwell presided. The presentation of the mark was made by Edward E. Whiting of Boston, representing the Knox Trail Commission. He told briefly of the plan and what the marker stood for, relating some of the history connected with the marker. The tablet was received by Rufus C. Brett, chairman of the Board of Selectmen, in behalf of the town. And I'll stop there. That same newspaper, 2 years earlier, when a joint commission, New York State and Massachusetts, set out to place markers in each of the communities from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston that Henry Knox and the cannoneers had traveled. The Springfield paper noted there was some difficulty in identifying where the trail is in South Berkshire. Well, shouldn't have been. There's several of us in this room know exactly where it went. Take you out there when the snow melts. They published, and I'll pass this around for fun, they published a map showing where they had particular difficulty identifying the exact location of the trail. One was north of North Egremont, which is exactly the case, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. The other was east of West Davis, I'll simply tell you that it's in Otis State Forest, unmolested, probably the longest stretch, certainly in Massachusetts, of the Knox pathway. You can still, if you know where to find it, some of it's not too hard to find, some is. It'll give you a taste of what Knox went through. It was not as snowy a winter as this is today. I feel obliged to introduce this by talking about the native inhabitants who go back at least to early woodland times. They did and they didn't leave much evidence behind. They did not have a print history tradition, it was oral history, and the players shifted around. The mountains going up the east and west sides of Berkshire County formed sort of a natural barrier that worked for and against later settlement. By the mid and late 1600s, there's considerable, this has been building up pressure between the native inhabitants and the white settlers for land. And King Philip's War was a violent series of confrontations in eastern Massachusetts, and settlement in what became Berkshire County was slim to none for whites because of fears of Indian attack. There certainly exist remnants in the woods, particularly in what's been discovered in Sandusfield, of very, very early native habitation. Archaeological work has been done in one spot in Stockbridge, which detailed a little bit later life. I will just leave that topic alone by saying that the largely shrinking Mohican tribe consolidated in Berkshire County in their 1730s. But I'll go back before that. The earliest that I have been able to identify white inhabitant of what's now Berkshire County came in 1662. His name was Samuel Purley. And he lived somewhere in South Berkshire. I would venture that he lived somewhere near the Housatonic River, probably in Great Barrington, because that's a natural stopping point on what, to keep things simple, I'll call it the Knox Trail. It went by a good number of names, including the Great New England Fur Trail, which baffles me a little because there were battling fur interests in Springfield. John Pynchon had a big fisthold on fur trade going up the Connecticut River Valley, and competing interests coming out of Albany and into the patroon ships along the east side of the Hudson River. At any rate, Purley was sent out with materials and with instructions to construct some sort of small building that would serve as a trading post and secured furs, which he would send back to Springfield. So what became the Knox Trail existed at least as a footpath at that point. In 1676, the first of what I identify as military uses of this road occurred in 1676. Major John Talcott and a group of Connecticut militiamen pursued 200 fleeing Narragansetts. This was in the last days of King Philip's War. And somewhere in the Housatonic River Valley, dispatched many of them. That's the wording that was on a DAR marker in Great Barrington until somebody took it or threw it in the river and did something with it, because it's a very negative episode to be commemorating. There's still a stone marker by the bridge. The lettering is all worn off. Talcott could have caught up with the Narragansetts in Great Barrington. They could have continued south. It could have been in Sheffield. Could have been. There was anything that's been written about this, the Talcott raid, as it's called, came 20 or 30 or more years later. The military folks weren't that sharp on documenting everything they did. There survives some information in documents about the condition of the road as it emerged. The Native American population had trails all over the place for hunting purposes, perhaps for trade, for visiting families elsewhere. But there grew an greater interest in connecting Blandford with Westfield and Blandford with Sheffield. And so it all squeezed down to a single roadway after a fashion. In 1694, a Benjamin Wadsworth was traveling from Westfield to Blanchard to Upper Sheffield. Upper Sheffield, for those of you who don't know, is Great Barrington today. We living in Great Barrington got tired of being part of Sheffield. It was too far to go to church. And it is nonsense. So we split off in 1761. That was the same year Berkshire County was carved off from Hampshire County, and 4 counties were created: Hampshire, Hampden, Franklin, and Berkshire. Great Barrington was the initial county seat, of course. Anyway, 1694, none of this had happened yet, but he's on his way toward Upper Sheffield, and he wrote, "The road which we traveled this day was very woody, rocky, mountainous, swampy, extreme bad riding it was. I never saw so bad traveling as this was. The greater part of this road this day was a hideous, howling wilderness." Well, that quote lived on. Everybody loves to use it today. And you could go out some nights and say the same thing, especially as a segment from West Otis up over toward Blanford, where there's no houses. Yeah, that's okay. Moving up a little bit, how did the road emerge? 1737, a number of Upper Parish inhabitants, I have their names, Samuel Lee, John Sargent, Timothy Woodridge, you don't need to know them, filed a petition with Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Bay Colony at that time was dealing real estate. It wanted to disperse land rights to white settlers to promote income, to create a buffer, military buffer, whatever reasons. They filed a petition, and they gave this description of the condition, which was poor at best, of the future, more or less, Route 23 to Westfield, asserting that those signing the documents 7 months previous did, and I'll quote, "undertaken with great fatigue and difficulty upon our own cost and charge, make a good and feasible sleigh road from New Glasgow," which is what Blandford was called, "being, according to common estimation, 35 miles, by which means a much more safe and convenient way of transportation is now opened from said Sheffield and the several settlements upon the Housatonic River to Westfield and the neighboring towns." So, note, it was a sleigh road, and note, they marked trees as best they could for travelers to find their sleigh road. And in the summer, you think you could find the sleigh road? Well, But that was it for road improvements until 1758. I refuse to write a text to read to you, so it takes me a few minutes to find the appropriate document to read next. Yeah, it should be here somewhere. 1734, actually this precedes the example I gave you previous. The Reverend Nehemiah Bull of Westfield traveled west preliminary to establishing the mission in Stockbridge. According to his Stockbridge historian Electa Jones, quote, a road had been cut through the wilderness since the purchase of Housatonic being another name for South Berkshire, but it lay over the rugged is in italics, as a less evil than the wet, in other words, woods instead of swamp. And those acquainted with the face of the country between Springfield and Stockbridge may perhaps form some conception of the pleasure of the trip. As an aside, especially between here and Otis, there's a stretch of Route 23 that, if you look at either side, you're obviously driving through a swamp. Well, that's not the Knox Trail. It didn't exist. It's nearby. See my wife sitting over here saying, "Would you find this stuff faster? You're going too slow." Anyway, come 1758, the French like New England, the British like New England, the Native Americans like New England. So there's squabbles. The last of the French and Indian Wars is going on. And in September of that year, 1758, the co-brigadier of British forces in America, Geoffrey Amherst, was on his way to Quebec via Fort Carillon. When the French owned Fort Ticonderoga, they called it Carillon. When the British owned it, it was Ticonderoga. Back and forth a few times. Amherst, after successes in elsewhere, came from Boston, was headed to Albany so he could head north to Fort Carillon and then onward to Quebec City. He had been victorious at Cape Breton Island. He now had a battalion or two. It's hard to quantify what a battalion was, but sounds like it's about 4,000 soldiers, which is probably the largest troop movement ever through South Berkshire County. And you have to consider how you move that many foot soldiers through a wilderness. Amherst had consulted with others in Springfield. He had originally thought he would go through Connecticut over the Hudson River north, but this sounded like a little bit shorter. So he came in this direction. He had consulted with Lieutenant Colonel James Roberts in Springfield, and Amherst wrote of Roberts, "He has been to the Green Wood and thought by pioneers and the help of some country people to where we might pass that way, so I changed my intended route." The Green Wood, keep things simple, is from here to Otis, to Blandford. Now, a lot of fighting had been going on the more or less just south of Ticonderoga, and there was a skirmish called the Bloody Sunday Scout, a massacre which took the life of Captain Ephraim Williams, which is of note because in his will he left money that established a educational institution in Williamstown. I don't need to tell you the name. But he was killed. Actually, the location of the massacre is marked by a monument. We visited the place. I forget what the highway number is on. Anyway, warfare changed rapidly over the years. In Europe, it was common to have battalion face battalion, you know, and maybe some kneel in front, others stand up, and others load their weapons and fire shots at me. Warfare here was dictated by the Iroquois and Mohicans and Mohawks and Onondagas. All the native people fought much differently. You hide behind trees, you ambush. And the whites learned this lesson at the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. All of that was fought behind stone walls and behind trees, with the British soldiers standing out there not knowing what's going on. Amherst was very aware of taking his soldiers safely through the woods. But he had to feed them. No one lived out here. So there were draft animals, probably horses or oxen, I don't know. They had carts and wagons. They had to bring supplies. And so he needed a decent road, and he was nervous about marching single or double file down an Indian path through the woods. So leading the contingent was a group of 200 individuals called pioneers, the equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers, under Major James Coffane. And they widened, straightened, flattened the existing sleigh road, Indian Trail, and Amherst was able, he still couldn't put his out, you know, he didn't have scouts on the out years, he had much. But he wrote September 26, I marked at 7 o'clock by the right and by half file with flank platoons, whatever, I don't know what that means. The 4th of the right grenadiers forming the front and flank and platoons ready, always to march likewise as flank platoons. We marched through the woods, bad roads and over steep hills, 11 miles to Blandford, where we encamped. Blandford was called Glasgow. It is a settlement of 25 years, has a great deal of ground cleared around it for that time, 20 families in it, mostly Irish. Now Glasgow, I believe, is in Scotland. So why Irish? Well, they were Ulster Scots. And in fact, this is where I commodify my costume. There were 2,000 Scotsmen in one of these platoons. During the Scottish clearances of 1746, with the last battle at Culloden, the British prevailed. The Scots clans were decimated. Their lands were taken. They were forbidden. The men were forbidden. Could not carry weapons. Could not wear their tartans. Had to leave their bagpipes behind. The only recourse to maintain your male dignity was to join the British Army, which some did. And so this group coming through Monterey was under the charge of Lieutenant Colonel Simon Fraser of Labatt, there were a lot of Simon Frasers. So this one was from about 78th Regiment of Foot, also known as Fraser's Highlanders. Picture them, well, after they came through here, they stayed in Great Barrington for a couple of nights. Okay, picture them, you know where the Green River is and this big cornfield there? 2,000 Scotsmen out there with wearing their full kilts. It's getting to be late in the season. They weren't cold because the kilt, all 9 yards, as they say, you can wrap around, keep warm. And they were able to wear bare arms. They could play their bagpipes. And the bagpipes figured in the Scottish way of fighting. When they, earlier in 1745, been victorious over the British in Prestonpans near Edinburgh, they'd snuck up on the British through the swamps, and they come bursting out, waving their swords, and the bagpipes blaring, and they just made a fierce presence, which put the British briefly in shock, and then they later, greatly outnumbered, were sent back. I love this aspect of my story because on my maternal side, I'm a part of the Rose clan. And we had a castle, it's still there in northernmost Scotland. I haven't visited it. But, and there were roses within within Fraser's unit. What's going on meanwhile in Sheffield, Great Barrington? Well, the Sheffield town leaders in 1773 voted the so-called Sheffield Resolves, which was a declaration of independence of sorts, and this took place in the John Ashley home in Ashley Falls. A couple of years later, what was called the first open resistance to British rule took place when the court was closed by an increasing number of less rebellious folks. And the court at that time stood approximately in front of the present Great Barrington Town Hall. So I'm saying this because South Berkshire was largely patriot. There were Tories here and there. Most of them were chased away. A few survived all this. But come 1775, the British are besieging Boston. George Washington is in charge of our military. He's a little desperate for what to do. He's under armament. He's underarmed, under-soldiered for that matter. But young bookseller Henry Knox, who's self-taught in military tactics and armaments and such. I don't know if he came up with the idea or he immediately embraced it, but whatever. How about, the Green Mountain Boys have just taken Ticonderoga. There's a whole bunch of cannon up there. We could use them, couldn't we? Washington said, "Oh, okay." So he sent off Henry Knox. He would be a colonel, except he didn't get the paperwork in time. So he traveled as a civilian with his brother and probably with a valet or attendant, and went to Ticonderoga, got the cannon. Hired the construction of 42 sleds, hired teamsters, 80 teams of animals, mostly oxen, also horses, and loaded on the armament. Some sleds there was just the cannon itself, not the carriage. And he carried no gunpowder, no cannonball. Some sleds had one or two cannons, howitzers, mortars or cohorns. The largest piece weighed a ton, and that was on a big sled by itself. 59 pieces in all, totaling 119,900 pounds. He struck out, his thought was he'd be able to head south on the Hudson River, but it was not a chill enough winter that the ice was very thick on the Hudson. So he mostly had to go down by land. Crossing the Mohawk River, they lost one cannon into the water. They later retrieved it. But he had to change plans immediately. By the time he reached the east side of the Hudson, they headed for Kinderhook and what's today Hillsdale, entered Berkshire County through Alford on what's now Route 71. At the state line, there are two markers, one for the New York and one for the Massachusetts commemoration. Continued through North Egremont into Great Barrington. The highway through the middle of Great Barrington was a little different than today, because if you know where Finnerty Stevens Funeral Home is, that road didn't exist. It was to the left, down the bank, behind the police station. Maple Avenue didn't exist. At any rate, he got through. I'm convinced that Knox probably stayed the night with Colonel Elijah Dwight, who lived in what's now called the Dwight Henderson House. It's still in town. It's the building right south of CVS Pharmacy. The building itself has been moved 3 times, but I considered a total witness to what was going on. From there, they proceeded out approximately Route 23. You can imagine that the way up the mountain near Butternut Basin was not what it is today. And I don't know how they accomplished it, but it came up from the valley, and somehow they got through and plugged along. I think our local historians agreed. From there, they went out Brett Road, turned, went into, well, the center of Monterey has changed. To keep it simple, probably took Hoopi Road out. There's a possibility that they broke into more than one group. They did not travel as a single train. Knox had the same problem Amherst did, and how do you feed all these teamsters? How do you feed all of these animals? Well, there were sympathetic farmers along the way until there were no sympathetic farmers living there. So you go in small groups. By Knox's time, there was a tavern in what's now Beartown, Chadwick's. There was a tavern in Montreal, and Monterey Brewers, which is still up here at the top of the hill. Somehow they made it through to Otis, crossed the Farmington River, went up. The Marker Commission that came through in 1927 did the best job it could. It made a mistake in Egremont, but I'm not going to talk much about that tonight. In Monterey, I think it's in the wrong place. It makes sense because you want the marker out by the highway so people will see it. If it went where it really belonged, nobody would ever see it. That's the trouble with Sandusfield, so they didn't get a marker in Sandusfield. The marker in Otis, conveniently, is exactly on the Knox Trail. You wouldn't know it, but there's a path that goes up to the left, and it's all there still. The one in Blandford folks have told me that that's not quite, it didn't quite go the way it did. It's up not too far from the fairgrounds. I think it was near the fire station or town office. Anyway, Knox kept a journal, and he made notes when he was in Clavert, New York. Think he had anything to say about South Berkshire? No, not much. Though he did say something about Monterey. This is 10th of January. Reached number 1. Monterey, Turingham didn't exist yet. It was number 1 township at that time. Reached number 1 after having climbed mountains from which we might almost have seen all the kingdoms of the earth. I guess he was impressed. A miracle that people with heavy loads should be able to get up and down such hills as are here with anything of heavy loads. Ultimately, Knox traveled some 300 miles in 56 days. He left Ticonderoga December 1775, reached Dorchester Heights March 4, 1776. I won't go into this, but the British, not too long after, left Boston. War breaks out. Berkshire residents, many enlist in the military and serve at Bennington and Saratoga. Our side prevailed at Saratoga, capturing many in General John Burgoyne's army. Among his army members were Hessians and Brunswickers and other for-hire soldiers from little duchies in Europe. And there's a certain degree of politeness went on in negotiations. Anyway, the Brunswickers were never considered prisoners of war. They were what was called the Convention Army, which I suspect means they were not shackled, they were not treated as prisoners. I don't know that they carried any weapons, but it was sort of a friendly imprisonment. They came in the reverse direction through Berkshire that Knox had taken. They came, one contingent came through Great Barrington, and the military leader, von Riedesel, stayed with Elijah Dwight in Great Barrington. Another contingent, including Mrs. Van Riedesel, came through Stockbridge, through what's wrongly called Burgoyne Pass, but up into Beartown, and came out and joined. They joined the same road, going the rest of the way through Monterey and onwards. So that I consider the fourth use of this highway as a military road. The fifth one came in, before I'm going to run out of time, but I want to share an interesting anecdote about Jeffrey Amherst, who has a bad reputation, deservedly probably, for hating Indians and having provided infected blankets to some tribesmen in New York State or elsewhere. Here, there was an interesting incident as his men came through Blandford, Otis, Monterey. And this account comes from James Thompson, a grenadier sergeant who wrote it in 1758. As we were marching in column through a wilderness kind of place in New England called Greenwood, we arrived at an open space where there was a small house and somewhat of a farm, Thompson recalled. The drumbeaters of several of the regiments got together and went to ask the woman of the house for some milk. This was not unusual, as Scotsmen greatly disdained pork and bacon, in particular, and were accustomed to bartering with housewives for food of their liking. The woman provided the milk in exchange for, quote, a few coppers, excepting John Wilkie, a lad belonging to our regiment of Highlanders, who hadn't a copper to give her. Amherst rode up. This is me talking. The woman, indignant at being shorted, complained to Amherst about the drummer. Amherst was amused and related the story to Fraser. Fraser, supremely proud of his Highlanders, took Amherst's comment as a compliment, as a complaint. Embarrassed that it was the actions of a man under his command who prompted the complaint, Fraser called a drumhead court-martial and punished Wilkie with 200 lashes and immediate discharge, according to Thompson. Within a couple of days, perhaps while Amherst was on layover in Great Barrington, the general saw Wilkie walking off from camp and had him brought to his tent for interrogation. Was he a deserter? Wilkie produced his dishonorable discharge papers. Amherst, in reading them, realized the situation that he had inadvertently brought about the man's disgrace. Amherst made amends. He engaged Wilkie as his confidential body servant, his valet. The last military use of the road was 1887, the tail end of Shays' Rebellion. Again, this was related to the American Revolution. Many of the local soldiers coming home from service, if paid at all, were ill-paid. They had attained debts while they were away. Their farms had been neglected. So many of them rebelled. And, of course, a bunch of looters and ne'er-do-wells joined them, and there was a raid on Stockbridge, and that mob was heading south to Sheffield. The forces of good learned of this, and General Benjamin Lincoln in Springfield sent a group of militiamen in pursuit. They took the Amherst Knox Trail to Great Barrington down toward Sheffield, where there was a confrontation, and that site is marked with a marker. It's on the Appalachian Trail. It took place at a field there. There was one death, and that was the last skirmish of Shays' Rebellion. It's been a fun project for me to research. Actually, I only spent a year and a half on it, Rob. I had other things to do. And I had the help of local historians in each of the communities, and most of them are here tonight as well, and pieced together the exact route, as far as we know, through South Berkshire. I've been on sections of it in Alford, North Egremont, Great Barrington. You walk down Main Street, you walk in the little driveway to the Water Street Cemetery. That's the old highway, not the one by the pizza house, but up through the cemetery and back. Remember, all these roads were, they weren't, that didn't come until the 1920s. And I'm going to shut up. That gives you an overview, before and after Knox.
Thank you so much, Bernie. That was incredible. And if you want to read more, please get his book, because there's those stories and many, many more. If there are any questions, and I expect there are, in order for the audience, both on Zoom and CTSB, if you could come up to the front and speak into the microphone, and that way everybody will be able to hear. So when you come up, just watch the cord here. So who would like to come on up and ask a question? I saw a few hands there.
All right.
Oh, you are.
John? If there are other questions, maybe at the same time, you can just kind of line up over here.
I didn't realize I was a Sheffield resident. But, anyway, my question, I'm not as familiar with the history, obviously. So how did Knox and the others cross the rivers? The Lusitanic, the Farmington, the Connecticut, those rivers. How did they do it? With their bridges?
I will only answer to Berkshire County. Yes. The Great Bridge in Great Barrington existed, it was wooden. It was, you know, Farmington, I'm not so sure. They may have had to ford it. I didn't get into that. Where they crossed is quite south, a little bit south of the village center in West Otis. And there's a snowmobile bridge crossing there now. I don't know. I can't answer for the second, but there was Housatonic, they crossed a bridge. Okay, more easy question.
Support.
That's a little high for me. If the marker here in Monterey were placed accurately, where would it be?
Well, Rob and I are kind of fond of the place out in Beartown, but
Yeah, so, it's a fair question, and the answer is they may have gone both ways. I mean, they could have gone the Route 23 route, they could have gone Beartown and Hoopie Road and Brett Road. So the Brett Road, Hoopie Road, Beartown Road was the old center. And that's why we think they're more likely, there were more homes along that route and more places for people to be fed. And there was at least the one tavern, Chadwick's Tavern. However, they could have gone this way and split up. As Bernie said, they might have split up to be able to disperse and get. So the marker that's just up the road here is the expedient location. It's where people really see it. And we can't say definitively that Knox and his troops did not come this way, because it's very likely they did. So it may be wrong, but it wouldn't be wrong to put it in Old Center near the training ground, for example, might be a good spot, because that was the Revolutionary War training ground on Beartown Road at the corner of Fairview Street or Fairview Road and Carrington Patel Road. So that would be a logical place to put it as well.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Colleen?
that was a hard one.
This is sort of a nuts and bolts question about road
Come
preparation.
on up and speak at the
You were
mic.
talking about the crew that acted as a kind of a corps of
Pioneers.
Yeah, so as they were moving, say,
Speak
you
into
have
the microphone.
a lot of people and heavy equipment, and you're potentially, I'm assuming, moving through marshy areas unless they took little constant curves up around. I thought about that a lot. I'm on Hoopie Road, and it's pretty, I had to have been pretty mushy toward Terringham. So did they have a crew that was moving with them, that was constantly, say, filling holes and, you know, trying to build up areas that were marshy in order to carry the weight of all that equipment?
Yes and no. That's what James Clefane's 200 Pioneers were doing. And they were avoiding mushy areas. What did they have for tools? They had pickaxes probably, and maybe hoes. They didn't have much in the way of tools to work with. They preferred to, that's why the early roads are so curvy. The Indian population didn't want to go through the swamps either, so they took high ground, preferred quite high ground. And it occurs to me too that in winter, if there's any snow to be shoveled, they had wooden shovels. They didn't have steel tools to speak of. They had anything, it was cast iron. And they had axes and probably hands, buck saws, but they cut down trees, but they kept to the high ground as best they could.
So they weren't necessarily, say, a mile ahead doing prep. They might
Yes,
actually.
they were.
Oh, okay.
They were maybe a 2-week start.
A 2-week start. I
Well,
was just wondering.
they were ahead.
Right. But in the case of what do you do when you get stuck right then? Were there crew with the actual, the soldiers and the oxen and such who were doing road prep?
There were 200
Immediate.
designated men doing road prep. And 3,800 soldiers waiting behind impatiently to get through. They had no choice. But they moved fairly quickly. They had to widen it so that wagons and carriages could come through. I didn't read it, but Amherst reported on one night a tree fell on one of the wagons and did some damage. So there were perils to be encountered. Is that good?
Any other questions?
Yeah. It's hard for me to understand.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you, Bernie. Next week, we will have another in this series. Gary Levier will be giving a talk on the section of the Knox Trail through Columbia County into Alford, Egremont, and into Great Barrington. So come on back and learn some more. So thank you again for coming.